Hello, hello. Vaden here with a quick solo intro as Ben is away today in India in July. So heaven help him and his pale, pale skin. We are releasing a bonus episode from Ben's other pod, Do You Even Lit, with friends of the podcast Cam Peters and Richard Meadows. The premise, for those who haven't listened to it, of Do You Even Lit is STEM people, kind of like ourselves, reading fiction. Reading the classics. In fact, it's a great podcast. They have all sorts of super funny and excellent discussions on various books. Today, the episode we're releasing is part 1 of a 2-part series. You'll have to jump over to their feed for the second part on Homer's Odyssey. If you want to find more from Cam and Rich, you can find Rich's work at his blog Deep Dish. Cam is on Substack at Fallible Pieces, and may as well plug Benny's Substack as well, which is Steps to Phaeacia. How do you spell Phaeacia, you ask? Phaeacia. Super easy word. And with that, let's hope Mr. Ben has brought in enough sunscreen to India. I don't even know if there is enough sunscreen that can save that pale, pale skin of his, but here's hoping, and back to our regular nonsense next episode.
Last night, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I wrote one about this reading experience. So just to give an example of the meter.
Let's go.
So my one goes, Higgledy-piggledy, Emily Wilson's contemporary Odyssey is easy to read, although her explicit progressive agenda may make it a bit complicated indeed.
Welcome to Do You Even Lit? For book club this week, we're doing Homer's The Odyssey, the epic story of how the legendary Greek hero Odysseus made his way home from the Trojan War, and all the twists and turns and misadventures that he suffered along the way. This is a very old book, almost 3,000 years old, but I think our discussion of it is about as timely as it's ever going to get, because there is a modern translation out by Emily Wilson that is both critically acclaimed and quite controversial. Not only because she's a woman, but because of various translational choices that she's made. So we are going to get a bit into the translation discourse in this episode and use it as sort of a jumping off point to discuss more broadly what things were like in Homer's time, Bronze Age morality, and the challenge of trying to prevent modern sensibilities from seeping into an ancient text like this. Then we will do another episode afterwards where we talk a bit more about the plot beats and some of the character analysis and other themes. I'm really excited about this one. I convinced the boys to do this. That's Benny and Cam, who you're going to meet shortly. My name is Rich, and this is Emily Wilson's The Odyssey. Let's get into it. Before we get into the translation discourse and start comparing things, I want to know what you guys thought of this book in its own right. So, Cam, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, I can start. I think I have to admit that I loved it. I loved the reading experience. Like warts and all. I think there are some legitimate criticisms of her word choices and her motives as a whole. But like that said, like I really, really enjoyed it. And I'd recommend this. And like at times it felt like I was eating the lotus plants or the siren song. Like I sort of couldn't, I couldn't stop. Like it felt easy. And it was weird. You kind of have that nagging feeling that reading Homer shouldn't feel this easy. Like, yeah, I loved it. It was great. I'm glad we picked the book.
Nice.
Yeah, that's funny. I think I'm totally aligned with Cam on this one, honestly. Like, Wilson's translation was so easy to read that it felt like cheating at some points. How are we just going through it this fast and I can understand everything this easily? But it made the experience just fantastic, and you were just able to get right into the story. And yeah, there was absolutely no hiccups when it came to language or understanding or anything, which for me as a first-time reader of the Odyssey was fantastic. I think if I was to go back and read it again now, understanding the storylines, then I'd be tempted to read another translation.
I read the Robert Fagles translation several years ago, which is probably like the canonical go-to translation these days, or at least prior to this one. And then I was also the one who was agitating for us to read Emily Wilson. I was really hyped about it. I basically made us do this book. And once I actually started reading it, I freaked out, and I think I messaged you guys saying like, shit, maybe this is not the one. Like, maybe we should read Fagles, because I don't want your first experience of Homer to be sort of flat and muted and contemporary. And then you guys said that you're enjoying it, and then I kept reading more, and I just started to really enjoy it as well, and just basically found it, yeah, as you've said, like very crisp and modern and easy to read. I think like a good test is like when you're going to sleep at night, some of the books we've read, I try and read them. I'm like, I just don't have the brain juice to tackle this right now. But this one it's just a nice story that you're being told. You can read it as you're drifting off, no worries.
Quickly, that metric there is funny though, because when you're thinking of great books, almost you'd wonder if that's like an anti-metric, that is like a beach read. It's so easy. It's kind of, like I feel a little bit ambivalent about it.
Well, we might be overstating it slightly as well, because it's kind of like it may be more relative to what you expected, right? You thought it would be maybe you thought it would be quite a battle and a bit dusty and boring, but in actual fact it moves along nicely and doesn't have too many weird words that you have to look up and so on. Yeah, but some people want it to be more difficult, which is like the first substantive criticism of the book, basically, is that the Wilson translation like strips out some of the majesty and pomp and ceremony from the poem, which a bunch of people are mad about. I think it'll be very useful just to compare a few passages. I'm going to go from Fagles to Wilson just to get a sense of what people are talking about. And I'm going to start with the very first lines of the poem, which I think give a really good example of the differences. So Wilson starts out, "Tell me about a complicated man, Muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy. And where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home." So compare with Fagles, "Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds, many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea." So you can see that Fagles is, I think, maybe more poetic in the sort of colloquial version of the word poetic, in this type of language choices he's making there. And then just to read a little bit from the end of that passage. "Now, goddess," this is Wilson again, "now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning." Whereas Fagles says, "Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too." Where I think actually I like the Wilson bit much better, even though it's sort of more clipped and precise. I love the phrase "find the beginning," which I'm pretty sure is a Wilsonism, and which is like really stuck in my head. So there's a certain sort of poetry in being quite terse and finding ways to strip things down to their bare essence as well, which I actually really like. So I'm kind of ultimately on the fence as to which version I like better. But first, have you guys dipped into the Fagles at all, or any other translation? And do you have any strong opinions either way?
Yeah, so I dipped into Fagles, and I also dipped into Samuel Butler's. Which I'm not sure if that's older or newer than Fagles. And Butler actually made the interesting choice to not write it as poetry. So we should say, obviously, the Odyssey is like a big, epic 12,000 line poem written in dactylic hexameter, which I think is particularly...
Say that 5 times.
Yeah, say that 5 times fast. Which is, I guess, a particularly good fit for ancient Greek. And then Emily Wilson actually uses a different rhyming scheme. So she uses just iambic pentameter.
Just quickly for the listeners, so there's this sort of dactyl was kind of this like da-da-dum, da-da-dum. And so that if you think of the ancient Greece, like a lot of words fit into that. So like Perseus, Theseus, Sophocles, Plato, Telemachus, Socrates. And so it's kind of
nice.
Working like that. I actually ended up, I used to write double dactyl poems, which kind of have this meter. And last night, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I wrote one about this reading experience. So just to give an example of the meter.
Let's go.
So my one goes, Higgledy-piggledy, Emily Wilson's contemporary Odyssey is easy to read, although her explicit progressive agenda may make it a bit complicated indeed.
Wait, sorry, that was dactylic hexameter. What you just did?
That's called a double dactyl. I'm not. That's the dactyls are the da 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 da, and then the easy to read is slightly different. But then as you were saying, so Wilson uses a different meter, right?
Yeah, she uses a different meter, which is arguably, I mean, meters make more or less sense in different languages. And as you were just saying, like a lot of the words and names in particular in ancient Greek fit really nicely into dactyls. But then Butler just went out of his way he just wrote it as a story. So it's like you open the book and it's just written like any other book would be written, which honestly started to make me think, like, what is the benefit of having this written as poetry? Arguably, there's a benefit when it's an oral tradition because it makes things easier to remember in certain ways. But as soon as you transcribe this thing onto the page, did you guys get anything particular out of it being poetry? Besides, knowing that you're hewing to the original in some sense? Like, did you read it any special way? Did it affect your reading of it? Or did you sort of just read it as like a normal story that's broken up into stanzas?
Well, Wilson's translation is kind of like, it's this weird kind of borderlands or liminal space of like it's metrical. So it's like, it's poetic in that sense, but like it also just reads as prose. And like, just to echo Richard's point before, like Wilson has a way with words as well. So when we say it's kind of stripped and plain, sometimes it feels a little bit deflated, but like a lot of the time, as you said, like find the beginning. I think there's some controversy around that with accuracy reasons, but like just as a turn of phrase is sort of beautiful, and a lot of it's very elegant. When I was 12 years old, as like an Eminem fan, I like got into rap, and like I got into like rhymes and meter then, and like just if you've never actually tried it, I recommend just trying it. And like you just these added constraints with writing, does make it so much more impressive. Like it's very impressive that she's done this in meter, and some of her translation choices are because of that. But
she went line for line as well, crucially, right? Like other people changed the length, and she forced it. Well, she worked hard to make it fit the original schema.
Yeah, which is interesting though, because actually I think I saw someone else talk that hers is maybe a bit of an abridgment of the poem, because the constraint of going line for line, you can't fit it all in. So like that's a lot of the reasons why the other translations like spill over, is because you kind of have to, because you can't fit it in one line in English. So like a lot gets, as we were saying, like she's stripping out a lot, and then you can have this argument, well, you're losing some of these details here and then some of this nuance there, which is this trade-off. But I saw someone said that maybe up until like a third of it, you could argue has been stripped out.
Oh wow,
that might be a high estimate, but maybe that's on the high end. But and I think other translators sometimes add things in, as Wilson does occasionally. I just want to quickly go back to the Wilson versus other translators, and like you wouldn't be surprised, as kind of my preference of this kind of plain language thing. I remember reading, I think the literary critic like Cyril Connolly, like demarcate two types of writing, like he calls it the Mandarin, which is kind of the ornate, flowery stuff, and then like vernacular. And he kind of said that at the time he's talking about like James Joyce is like the former, and then kind of Orwell and others is the latter. And I definitely like the kind of more plain style stuff. And even at the end there, so in the end of the proem, the first 12 lines that Richard read out, which they kind of say what's going to happen. And one of the points is that Odysseus and his crew go to an island of the sun god and eat his cattle, and they've been warned, like, just don't do that. Like, we'll kill you if you do that.
It's the one thing you must not do.
Yeah. Whatever you
have
do,
one job.
Yeah, it's kind of like Jesus, I'm getting brain fog. But what's the Cillian Murphy TV show? Oh my lord.
Peaky Blinders?
Yeah, sorry.
No fucking fighting.
Yeah, no fucking fighting. Like, don't eat the fucking cattle. No cattle. Like, just like, and then his crew doesn't fucking listen to him. But they say this in the first 12 lines. So Wilson talked about it and saying, and the god kept them from home. Talking about the sun god. If they eat the cattle, isn't going to let them get home. Which felt a little bit sterile. And then I saw like T. Lawrence renders this as like the sun god blotted out the day of their return, which just had a bit more aura around it. So like sometimes I prefer the Wilson stuff, and and sometimes I prefer others. I mean, here's actually one of my takes. I think if you read the whole thing, especially if it's first time, but if you read the whole thing, I much prefer the Wilson translation. But like almost any given line, if you sort of take it out of context, I often prefer the other translations, which give a bit more context and a bit more color. But like when you read it all at once, that it can be more tough.
And also probably because you know exactly what's going on because of the Wilson translation already. Like it's been very easy to follow. So now when you go back and read Fagles' line, you know exactly what's supposed to happen. So it's, you don't get caught by any of his language. You're able to just like purely enjoy the poetry.
Well, you're going to say something, Rich?
Oh, just one thing I noticed with some of the Twitter dunks is that they would take a single line and say, look at this artless, sterile way of phrasing this particular sentence. And it would be a single sentence fragment. Which I'm sure you could do that with. You could be extremely selective about it and choose, as there's 12,000 lines to choose from. Some of them are going to come across more or less well compared to where other translators have taken a little bit of liberty to make it sound cooler, basically. And there's always that balancing act between like the authenticity and whether or not you want to make it sound cool. And so this is this other element which comes up a lot, is like this, what she calls sort of stylistic archaicisms. And I thought it was a really fascinating point, where I love the Cormac McCarthy style Old Testament biblical prose with lots of weird archaic words that you don't quite know the meaning of and roundabout ways of saying things. And so like at first I was thinking, yeah, Fagles is just better because you want to kind of like revel in the language and enjoy some of these turns of phrases. But then she made this really fascinating point in her translator's notes, which is that all modern translations of Homer, in this case, are equally alien to the original work. So if you dress it up in Shakespearean language and you use thee and thou and thine and you throw in some old-timey words or something, that's like LARPing. That's not Homer. That's got nothing to do with a book or with a poem that was sung 3,000 years ago. It's like this kind of sham artifice that gives like a flavor of being like old and classical or something like that. But from a translation accuracy point of view, it's not a mark of authenticity. It's like just a weird stylistic tick that we've all sort of swallowed. And I think that's fascinating. It's such an obvious point in retrospect, but I'm torn here because I like that artifice. I like the McCarthy style, which, I think I said on that episode, some people might think is a bit pretentious, like aesthetically, but I can't deny that she has a really good point there, and I think it sort of shuts up. So it's a great rebuttal to some of the haters.
I think you want to push back on that slightly. Like, there's obviously a good point there, but if you go too far, you kind of end up in the land of like total relativism, like which sometimes, in some of her commentaries, she sounds like she's going like you can have there's like kind of no accuracy or like no spirit to this thing. Like everything's just like a entirely different work. And like at one point she said that, and it's not an entirely different work. If I was to translate some of these lines and use like kind of modern day like internet speak or like slang, like let's say like modern day slang or like colloquial like New Zealandisms or something, like I think you're losing the audience if you're saying like they're both equally like as different as Homer, and then you can always say, well, we don't actually know, like maybe he was talking in slang. Like it's just like fairly obvious he wasn't, and like. But
she doesn't use slang in here. She doesn't use modern slang.
It's not that. Yeah, I think that's right. Sorry, so it's not that all hers are incorrect, but like I'm just saying, if you take that line of thought seriously, like I think like that's the ad absurdum that you could just kind of have anything, like and like for instance. And at times, every now and then, I read something from her, and it does feel a bit, never too bad, but it does feel a little bit like Stephen Fry has all these mythical books that he released over the last 5 years, including the Odyssey recently, which I bought but didn't read. But every now and then, like Stephen Fry, who has, is one of the great wordsmiths of the time, talks in these kind of like almost parochial Englishisms, like, and now the gods enjoyed their tea and biscuits or something like that. Which is lovely, but like it's obviously departing, I think, from what the original was, and I think that the point I'm making is you can have more or less accuracy. I think it's possible. You can probably never have complete accuracy, and also along the lines of like kind of the spirit of it or the grandeur of it, like that could be a real thing that I think you could find from the original work, like of kind of an epic connotations or something like that, rather than quotidian. But you know, that said, I think it's a really strong point as well that you kind of forget. Yeah, it's like, oh, this is how we all learned it from the classics tradition. This is why we think.
It has to sound like Milton or Shakespeare.
Yeah. That's just because they were the first to do it, right?
And also, like, just on the accuracy point, I mean, obviously I don't know personally, but I believe that even people critiquing Wilson's translation say that actually, yes, Homer's often spoken quite terse clinical language, not unlike Wilson's, and that he is not about pomposity and grandiosity. There's going to be some kind of connotational stuff, which we're going to get into and which I think is worthy of criticism. But in terms of hamming the text up to make it kind of like a medieval reenactment type stuff, I think there's no strong basis for doing that. It's fine in terms of accuracy, neutral, I suppose. In terms of accuracy, it's fine to use neutral modern language, as Shakespearean language would not be in any way more accurate. Since you brought it up, I think this is like the next major criticism to address, is that the connotational stuff around her possibly stripping out some of the grandeur from the language in the sense of changing what Homer may have meant in the text, right? So, like, basically, okay, let me back up a little bit. This book came out in 2018. Emily Wilson is the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English, and there was huge press about this. 2018 is probably not quite peak woke, but it must be in the ballpark of peak woke. And so naturally there's a media firestorm. Everyone is hyping up this book, saying great things about it. And equally naturally, you get a backlash from the, anti-woke type people who think that, this is some kind of DEI thing, or Wilson is importing her feminist ideals into the book. So the first thing to say is that, like, having listened to some interviews with Emily Wilson and read a bit about her, she is clearly an incredibly skilled, knowledgeable scholar. She's been doing this for decades, and you can hear when she talks how much she absolutely loves this shit. And the fact that her book came out at this time has nothing to do with her. Whatever media narrative was spun around it is not her doing at all. I think it doesn't bear on the work at all. So I think, like, we should basically leave that aside. But then the actual substantive criticism is that, has she tried to impose modern sensibilities onto an ancient text? That's the real crux. And I think it's a really interesting question. So we should look at, like, the textual evidence as to whether she has done that. So Cam, do you want to talk about some of the decisions that she made and give us a bit of a jumping off point?
Yeah, sure. I mean, some listeners would have already heard about this one, but and Emily Wilson even wrote a whole bloody essay on it. But one of the word choices that caused the most stir was she called, and it comes right at the start. It's like the first or second line. She goes, "This is a story about Odysseus, like a complicated." No, it doesn't say Odysseus, but this is a story about a complicated man.
Yeah,
and if you don't know this book or this poem, you could kind of think, yeah, that whatever, but it caused a shitstorm, and not just like all these people that hate her because they're not aligned politically, but like some people said to her, I love everything about this translation apart from calling them complicated. So and just to be clear, so the ancient Greek was polytropos, which was only used once in this poem, and it was used at the start, and it was used to describe Odysseus. And there's these things called Homeric epithets, which often get used, which maybe we'll get into later, but which get used to describe different characters. So you get like Athena as grey-eyed Athena, or Hector from the Iliad as like a breaker of cities, or like you get the rose-fingered dawn, I think, is the way to describe the dawn, or the wine dark sea.
The wine dark sea
is the classic, which causes a bit of confusion because the sea doesn't seen that wine dark. I saw a joke online on
the Greeks didn't have the color blue or something. Like people think that they had no mental representation for the color blue.
Yeah, just wine. Yeah, did that come up in like testing like word linguistic stuff? I don't know.
Yeah, it was a Sapir-Whorf thing.
If you don't have the color for blue, then you're into sacking cities and killing your enemies.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we get this word polytropos, and so it's worth looking at how some other people did it. So I even said it before. So Fagles calls this a man of twists and turns, and what it literally means is poly is many, trop or tropos is to turn. So it's kind of this weird way to describe someone. It's like this of many turns, and that's another way that it sometimes gets translated as a man of many turns, a man of twists and turns. And I think Wilson, hummed and hawed about this one, and then went for complicated.
Imagine if she just said problematic.
Yeah. I had that. That would have caused shit. I mean, and that would. I think like I don't know. I could imagine
this would also be funny using it in like the Popperian sense. It wouldn't even be inaccurate.
Yeah, it would be funny.
Yeah. I don't know. Like I don't love complicated. Like I could imagine maybe warming to it a little bit, but like it seems a little bit psychologizing or internalizing, like for what that's meant to be, which maybe is a tendency of her, and there's also a potential tendency of her portrayal of Odysseus, like she wants to kind of bring him down a peg potentially, and in commentary of the Odyssey, you can do that. Like you can say, well, is this guy really a hero? Which we'll discuss about maybe in the next episode, but that's separate from like is Homer saying that him. So like I think it's kind of deservedly become a bit of a meme.
But hold on, like to me this seems like the height of anti-woke backlash to fixate on this word, because he is complicated. Like the narrator is describing him as many-sided or whatever. The narrator is imposing a judgment no matter how you slice it. And in this particular version, they're calling him complicated. I think people are like inserting a word in there that doesn't exist, like morally complicated or something like that. But it's not there. And he clearly is a complicated man. It just seems like I don't like that translation. I like a man of many turns or a man of twists and turns much better. But it doesn't like I think people are just like reading way too much into that word choice.
I think you're wrong invoking like it was an anti-woke backlash, mainly because a lot of people that maybe not quite as progressive as her, but didn't love that translation. I think because one, I think it's like it comes at the start, and two, it's like this was the one word that describes him, right? And it is this word. It's like this man of many turns, like is this way to describe him, and then to change it is complicated. I don't think it's. I think describing someone as like a complicated. I could imagine like some like NPR voice of like revisiting Odyssey. He's complicated. Like
the sin is that it's a bit of a nothing word, right? Like it's a bit of a. I think it's
psychologizing.
It suggests that you are pointing to something else, really, at least in modern parlance.
Like if I say Richard, my friend, is a complicated man, like I'm not at all alluding to this man who took this journey that ended up in circles and anyway, like that said, I think the reason we're talking about it is because there's a big shitstorm. Like you sort of don't notice it, especially if you haven't read it.
Should we talk about slaves and sluts and whores?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, sure.
Just on the wokeness and stuff. My understanding was that this issue mostly came up for her translation of the Iliad, which was much more recent, which was 2024, like 8 months ago.
I think it's just come up again. A man of many, a problem of many.
The translation of twist and turns.
Eternal recurrence.
So I mean, we haven't read that, obviously, but I would be interested to read that. I've heard some maybe more substantial criticism of that one. Yeah, I don't remember this being a huge deal at the time, and I'm wondering if like we're making a bigger deal of it in retrospect than it actually was in 2018, or if I'm just
this is like modern discourse, Benny. There's like I'm not on Twitter anymore, but when I was, there are tweet battles going around between people saying, slay queen, you got to read this amazing Emily Wilson, finally a woman is doing it kind of thing, and then counterpoints from scholars or Greek statue avatars being like, Emily Wilson's translation is trash, and here's why, and here's the side by side, and but let's not let's not talk about complicated anymore. Let's move on. So another good example is please don't start.
No, I was just gonna say our thesis. It's complicated.
Yeah. Then another good example is previous translators have translated. Basically, Greeks had house slaves. Not quite chattel slavery, but yes, chattel slavery. And Wilson just calls them what they are and says, like, sometimes she says house girl or house boy, but usually she says like took his slave or her slave and so on, and just doesn't shy away from that. And she also reverses imputation where some translators have called women like sluts or whores or something, where she reckons that's not actually, or bitch, where that's not actually implied by the original Greek. So people have also jumped on that as a point of saying, like, why did she's emphasizing that they keep slaves? And again, I think this is like ridiculous, and that her calling them slaves is what I want. If the Greek society had slaves, I want them to be called slaves. I don't want weird euphemisms to protect modern sensibilities, which is what she's being accused of doing.
Yeah, exactly.
So to the extent that she's right, and they are slaves, call them slaves. Don't call them servants.
I'm going to do that thing where I'm going to say, like, that's not happening and that's good. Potentially. Like, I'm not sure if people complain about her using slaves. Most stuff I've seen is like, yeah, like, fair enough. That's actually maybe a good direction of, like, the literal translation. Like, ultimately, yeah, I think it's fine. But it was, when you're thinking of the spirit of the translation, because, like, if you're going back to, like, a Homeric, like, Bronze Age morality of their views of slaves, it probably would have been a lot more similar to including from the slave's perspective, perhaps, you know, of how we might view a maid or a servant or something. So, like, to sort of capture the feeling of that for modern readers, that might be better. That said, you know, it is this way to kind of whitewash it and to forget that, like, ancient Greek society, like, had all these slaves. I think house slave might be a slight misnomer, but that doesn't really matter. But and so it's probably best just to talk about slavery and call them all slaves, and kind of in this, you know, pithy way of like, yeah, like, this is my loyal slave and this is my disloyal slave, and like that just being kind of a normal element of things.
Yeah, I mean, like, these very books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, talk about like capturing women in battle and taking them as your slaves. It's like
your war brides.
It's absurd to call them anything other than what they are, even though some of them probably are more like the somewhat more benign, you know, Roman style slaves that were in your family for a couple of generations and who you might free when you feel kindly towards them or something, which is like somewhat less brutal than the African slave trade. Or
yeah, I think people don't have a big issue with. If anything, I've seen people praising that as well. Okay, so I've seen some other stuff. Maybe like nothing's like terrible, but kind of when you take it all together, you're kind of thinking, oh, okay, like there seems to kind of be a motive here at play. And like, you know, for context, like she's explicitly talked around like an ideological angle to this. She often, you know, the white man's thing or patriarchal thing, like translation itself is kind of gendered and it like exalts the original, which like take gender aside, like that shouldn't be a problem. And so yeah, I'm getting some of this from an essay, which I think is quite a balanced essay and ultimately quite a positive essay. But it sort of points out, like, at one point, is near the end in book 24, so Odysseus and his son Telemachus preparing for battle, and they're kind of debating who's the better warrior. And Odysseus' father, Laertes, says this quite famous line of saying, like, what a happy day for me from the gods. Like, my son and my grandson are arguing about, in the ancient Greek, they use the word arete, or, you know, it looks like arete. Emily Wilson renders that as how they're arguing about how tough they are. This might not be a political thing, but it seems to be an incorrect choice there. Like, you know, there are probably dozens of theses talking about arete, which kind of means something more like virtue or excellence. Like, I'm sure there's a chapter in Richard's book labeled like arete, right? And it's like, it's not toughness. And
do you want me to read out the actual passage? I have it in front of me.
But can we maybe just pin that and talk about that in the context of like what the Greeks valorized, and then we can look at whether or not Emily Wilson is undermining what they valorized?
Yeah, no, that's cool.
So let's come back to that, I reckon. Yeah, and just like the explicit feminist stuff is that she claims that she's never had that her personal identity and beliefs are unlikely to have influenced it any more than anyone else. Imagine how intoxicating it must have been at that point in time. And you are getting like Yas Queened up the wazoo, and you are probably like, a modern feminist liberal woman. Imagine how hard it would have been to resist leaning into that and being like, yeah, I'm finally like smashing the patriarchy and telling the story the way it should be told and stuff. And she never said anything like that. She sort of...
I think she did. I should have...
Bring evidence, bro. Bring receipts, because I couldn't find anything.
Okay.
The only thing I could find is that in her introduction, she talks about how it's interesting to examine like male fears about female power, and the thing that you mentioned about how you are in some sense like revering a presumably male author as a translator. And so like some people would say maybe she's trying to sort of have it both ways by bringing up those points whilst also claiming to be not injecting her politics into her translations. But like, are all the male translators being grilled on their exact gender politics and the extent to which it's influenced the way that they translate the work? No, I mean, obviously not. And I've never seen her try to cash in on any of this stuff, even though it would have been like pretty hard to resist getting swept up in all of that. So yeah, I just think that's kind of a non-starter.
I don't have a million receipts, but okay, first of all, I think I disagree there, but first of all, like, I think ultimately with this translation, like, it doesn't seep through that much. So I think it's slightly there with some of these choices, because she's been explicit around it in her commentary around which maybe you think she hasn't been swept up in it that much. But even if we grant that she did get swept up in it a bit, I don't think it comes through that much in the translation. I think, it ultimately is like it's translating Homer, and the main thing is it's stripping things out and it's plain English. It's almost like that free speech meme. It's like, standing up, like, it's actually a pretty good translation. There's not much to worry about. Even if there's some truth to these concerns around, like, oh, I think she's choosing this because of these political leanings, which you can make. So, like, it's not, like, you see some stuff online saying she's like, crimes of the humanities and shit like that. It's just, like, absolutely absurd. And as you said, you have the opposite as well, saying, like, yes, Queen, like, we finally got, like, the reason they love it is because she shares our politics. It's like, finally, we've, but,
and that neither of these people on either side have actually, they came up with their conclusion first and then went out, looked for evidence to back it up. I don't think they did a neutral and dispassionate analysis and then decided the caliber of the work afterwards, right? But Cam, you have a substantive critique that I agree with and want to talk about, but more around how she might convey Bronze Age morality through the lens of modernity. But before we get there, can we just give a bit more background context? So, like, the historical time frame. Or you wanted to talk about civilization and barbarism here as well. So, do you want to talk about that? And we'll come back to it after we go through some of the Bronze Age morals.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, well, this is kind of related, I suppose, to what we're talking around. So there's this scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus, is quite early on in his journeys. He's gone to, the land of lotuses, and he ends up in the land of the Cyclops.
One of my favorite scenes, by the way.
Yeah.
The Cyclops interaction.
Yeah, so cool.
Yeah, so, I mean, does someone else want to quickly describe what's cool about the Cyclops?
I could try and do a quick gloss on it, if you like.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, so Odysseus and his men reach this land of shepherds, and they find a hut belonging to this one shepherd called Polytheus, I think. I don't have his name handy.
Polyphemus.
Yeah. Polyphemus, yeah. And they go and like knock on the door of his hut or his cave. They have this demand that people must be hospitable towards you when you're a wandering traveler. But he's not home. His men want to like steal the stuff, ransack the cave and leave, but Odysseus forces them to wait until he gets home. He gets back. Odysseus demands that he give them sustenance because they are guests, and Polyphemus is like, no, absolutely not. traps him in the cave, and then starts eating Odysseus's men. So he just brutally murders and eats them raw. So Odysseus has to like hatch a plan to get out of the cave because it's blocked by a giant rock. I don't know if I said, but Polyphemus is a Cyclops.
A 60-foot tall monster
Some key
who eats people.
here.
bearing the lead.
Also, can I just inject one thing here, which is that Cyclopses are like a non-trivially powerful race of being in this world, right? So like the primordial deities, which sort of kickstarted the universe in Greek mythology, gave birth to the Titans, which was the first generation of gods, and the Cyclopses. So the Cyclopses, in terms of like power and stuff, are at the same level of the Titans. And then the Olympians, which were the second generation, or the third, I guess, had the battle with the Titans and won. But so the Cyclopses have been around since, pre-Olympian times and are a pretty powerful race of being. And so it's not as if they're just battling with, Cyclops.
Just some tall guy with one eye.
Basically, yeah. And this Cyclops in particular is Poseidon's son. So that creates some problems for them later on. Yeah.
Which is hugely relevant. He's like the last guy you want to pick on if you're Odysseus.
Yeah, if you're trying to get home on the sea.
Do you want to tell the rest of it, Cam? Because it might be relevant to whatever it is that you want to talk about.
You trying to hand it off, Rich? Someone
it's doing such a great job.
So one other major theme in the Odyssey around hospitality, essentially. The Greek word is xenia. And we'll talk about that a bit more about that probably with Bronze Age morality, perhaps. But this is obviously like really important to the people at the time, and we get this early on. So the first 4 books of the Odyssey is actually about his son, Telemachus, which we'll talk about later. But like you get instances where he travels and there's hospitality shown to him. When Odysseus first goes, when he goes to these called the Thracians, this kind of like utopian place, these people that should show him this great feast. So this is really kind of important effort when they go to the land of the Cyclops. Like the reason Odysseus kind of wants to stay is kind of like, I might get a gift here or something like that. Like and he comes back, and the Cyclops comes back and like blocks the cave, like traps him in there with a boulder, and like eats some of the crew. And so it gets to this monster. So it's this like assault on sensibilities of like the opposite of like hospitality. And I just had this thought around like civilization versus like barbarism felt like important here, because, well, I mean, to go back to word choices again. So like Polyphemus is described, Polyphemus the Cyclops is described as the Greek word is athepmistos, which often gets rendered as like lawless. I think it literally means like without a sense of divine right or wrong. Wilson uses maverick, which like one is also like doesn't quite fit her aesthetic either. Like
watched too much Top Gun.
Yeah, it kind of jumps out. But like, so I think what's going on there is like, and Wilson's explicitly said this in commentary. Like she wants to raise the status a bit like of the Cyclops. And I think I kind of understand in this like civilization versus barbarism framework. Well, okay, so there's the economist Arnold Kling talks about these different frameworks of like trying to understand like the left-right divide, which is like an interesting question. Like, what causes people to like swing left or swing right? Like, and a lot of different people have thought of different ideas. Like Thomas Sowell has this one about like being constrained versus like being utopian, and then like I think Brian Kaplan's one is just like anti-markets versus like anti-left, which is like somewhat tautological. And then I kind of like this online guy Pallison who talks about like empathy, like empathy versus like systemizing. But anyway, Arnold Kling has this idea where like
many twists and turns.
Yeah, many twists and turns. Well, but it's related. I mean, we're talking about her politics and stuff, right? And I think it directly relates to this. So Arnold Kling's one is like he says there's different frameworks, like oppressed versus like oppressor is like one framework, and then like civilization versus barbarism is like this other framework. And he thinks that He also talks about freedom and tyranny, but you can put that aside for now. And he thinks that's the kind of big explainer for why people, the kind of political divide. So when you think of like Polyphemus and the Cyclops, he goes there, there's this kind of thing where I'd say it comes through in the poem, and a lot of people view it this way, or at least have rendered this way, of like, come into this kind of barbaric land, whereas like, they're literal monsters and they're literal cannibals, and they're not bloody, giving us a feast and wine and stuff as one thing, and they're like trapping us there, and like, you can use this other framework where it's like, well, actually, like, this is another culture, one, and be a bit more relativistic about it, but also like there's oppressed oppressor, and like there's this maybe the colonial aspect of like going there and like, viewing these natives as like evil people, and maybe this. So I just think like that is playing a role. One, how she talks about it, but two, maybe some of these translation choices. So go back to these motives. I think she doesn't want to make the Cyclops seem as negative as they have by other translators, and potentially as Homer is doing. There's another word as well, which even I think she translates as arrogant or insolent elsewhere, but like with the Cyclops, it gets called like high-minded. Again, maybe you can go too far and it's not too bad, but I did think that was kind of an interesting framework to think about.
There's still plenty of barbarism in here. Like, let me just read a quick passage about when the Cyclops attacks them. He reached his hands towards my men, seized two, and knocked them hard against the ground like puppies, and the floor was wet with brains. He ripped them limb by limb to make his meal, then ate them like a lion on the mountains, devouring flesh, entrails, and marrow bones. And then later on, there's a bit about how, like, he's spewing up gobbets of human flesh that are half-digested and stuff like that. Like, it's fucking gross, and it's meant to be gross, even by the standards of today. But yeah, I do remember also having the thought when I was reading the Odyssey for the first time, and I got to this bit, and I distinctly remember thinking, oh shit, Odysseus is not like a storybook hero. Odysseus is kind of a piece of shit. I mean, sure, the Cyclops attacks and kills his men, but like, Odysseus is being cheeky by demanding that he give him gifts and stuff, right? Like, surely that is taking the piss and stretching the concept of hospitality to break into someone's house and demand, with a bunch of armed men, by the way, and then demand that they feed you. Like, not even ask politely, right?
Yeah, and also, I mean, another thing around that is it's something Odysseus kind of gets wrong, even just for the safety of him and his friends. Often it's his crewmates as well. But this one, like, he kind of fucks up. I think the crewmates just want to, let's take the sheep and let's get out of here.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, let's stay. And even later on, they can't escape this cave because there's this boulder on the way, and they can't just kill the Cyclops because they can't move the boulder. So he manages to, I think they like hide under the sheep, right? They hold like the sheep's belly and like somehow hide. Well, I suppose it's the blind Cyclops. Oh, we're forgetting the main part actually. So they blind the Cyclops, right? And he wins with a pun. So like Scott Alexander and all that would be happy. Because he asks...
By getting him drunk,
asks,
we should say.
Oh yeah, so gets him drunk. And then the Cyclops asks, and gives him a fake name. It's just a normal night out, right? And the Cyclops asks what's his name, and he says, my name is Nobody, or my name... Emily Wilson renders it as No Man. My name is No Man. Which, by the way, I think is slightly better pun in ancient Greek, because nobody or no man is Otis, or like it sounds like Odysseus.
Yeah,
so that's kind of cool. And I think you can even nerd out a little bit of like exactly the grammar of when you talk about is anybody there, and you say nobody's there. It's like it kind of fits grammatically, something like that. But yeah. So and the Cyclops gets blinded by Odysseus, and then like his Cyclops buddy is yelling out. They're like, you okay in there? Like, what are you yelling at? He's like, what's happening to you? And he's like, nobody is killing me. Or like,
no man is doing me harm.
Yeah, no man is doing me harm. And they're like, okay, sweet. Yeah, he's right. He's going off again. That sounds like Polyphemus. And so, yeah, and it's kind of cool, this kind of wordplay element.
Well, you should just also say that, on the subject of Odysseus being sort of irresponsible with his men's lives, as they're trying to leave, he taunts the Cyclops to such an extent that the Cyclops is enraged and throws a giant, they're in the boat at this point and trying to sail away. and he enrages and taunts the Cyclops, and the Cyclops throws a boulder after them, and that creates such waves that it drives them back towards the shore, and then they only escape in the end by sheer luck, basically. And so he, Odysseus does have this element of wanting to always show that he's like the master of each situation. Even the second time they're trying to escape, he wants to taunt the Cyclops again, and all his men are like, no, shut up, like, we just need to get out of here, right? And so he does have this sort of...
his bragging element, yeah.
Well, he can't bear to be with his no name, right? He needs to actually...
He says his name. That's when he says his name, right?
Yeah.
When he's leaving, which is a big fuck up. It's kind of like, the Anon, like, he finally let his fucking name out.
Yeah, he doxed himself.
Yeah, he doxed himself, and now the gods are coming for you. And it's like, as we said, Polyphemus the Cyclops is Poseidon's, one of Poseidon's kids.
But I think we should probably just get into some more of the Bronze Age virtues, because that example just there, I believe, falls under the category of kleos or kleos, which is this idea of wanting your deeds to be known far and wide. So basically, I think what we would call glory or being remembered in the history books. And like, that's why Odysseus does that, right? He's like, he can't bear to escape without the Cyclops knowing who it really was who did this, so that his legend can live on. And in his culture, that's a good thing. It is interesting to consider, though, that at the exact same time is portrayed as an example of hubris, right? And Odysseus recognizes it himself when he's retelling the story. Maybe not that bit, but certainly the bit about where he refuses to leave the cave, where he's like, oh yeah, I probably shouldn't have done that. Do you guys remember if he regrets calling out his name and drawing Poseidon's wrath upon him once again?
I don't think he explicitly regrets it. I think it's more the reader notices, like, that's kind of where he may have fucked up one of the few times.
No, yeah, I never remember him really expressing regret. I mean, at this point, when he's telling us this, he's recounting it, firsthand to a king and a queen of an island he landed on. So we're sort of hearing it secondhand. And yeah, he doesn't put much of a morality spin on things, I think, or even like he doesn't put any sort of normative spin on his storytelling. I think it's mostly just he's like laying out the facts for them, which is an interesting device, I guess, that Homer used to actually talk about these adventures, right? So that it's all a little like potted.
Well, I'm not sure normative, but like he is like so the context is he's at the Thracians, which happens early on in the poem, and then there's kind of utopic sort of people, and he talks about all his ventures, and this is where he tells them about the Cyclops and is bragging about the Cyclops. But like in the story where he's saying how he's bragging about the Cyclops, he's also bragging to these people. The way, so it's not normative, but the way he's saying it is that he tells them, like, I'm a man of many skills, like I've the most skills in the world, and he says that quite a few times. Like he's
huge skills,
yeah, huge hands. So yeah, and like he is, like, for sure, like, don't get me wrong, like he bit the bloody Cyclops, but yeah, he's saying that first thing when he gets there. Which I wasn't aware.
No, he's not.
Until
he's not saying the first thing when he gets there. He waits a while, right? He doesn't divulge.
Strips down, rubs some oil, gets.
Well, no, and then he asked the singer there if he can sing about.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
The Battle of Troy, I believe, and then the singer starts singing about it, and he starts crying because of that. And I think actually they sort of make an inference based on the fact that he's crying, because of this story about I think it's specifically about the Trojan horse, actually, and then they sort of figure out who he is. So. I mean, this has been one thing that kind of bugged me about the whole poem, to be honest, was that he sort of wavers back and forth between wanting his name to always be known wherever he is and then sort of playing coy with people. And, this happens even when he like gets home. He doesn't tell Penelope or even Telemachus who he is instantly. But, with other people, he's very proud to let them know his name is Odysseus. And I haven't gotten inside his head enough to exactly figure out, when he wants people to know and when he doesn't.
I'm reading it as kind of like he's very strategic and scheming about the opportune moment to reveal who he is, but he always does ultimately want to do so. And there also seems to be this kind of Greek custom that I picked up with Telemachus's interactions with the households that he stays with as well, where you sort of like pretend to be modest and a little taciturn until you're called upon to say your piece, but you do actually want to hold forth, but you're kind of observing the ritual of being asked to tell your story or something like that. You don't come in like all guns blazing. Does that resolve it at all? I'm not actually 100% on that, but like that was just the general impression.
It's a bit like when someone offers to pay for something, right? You're like, no, I won't.
Yeah, exactly.
Like everyone kind of wants it or wants a little bit of it, like, but you don't want to say it.
Yeah,
like you're almost annoyed if they like accept it. You're like, no, I'll pay, and you'll be like, no, don't worry about it, and you're like, okay. And they're like, what?
But Benny, I want to pose you a broader question on Bronze Age morality as a whole. Like, how would you frame it in modern language if you had to? Like, what is your read on the sort of general ethical framework that they subscribe to the extent that there is something cohesive?
Oof, I think that's a good question. I hadn't actually thought about it like that. Mostly I just went through, a list of what I think comprise Bronze Age morality. But, if we were to step back and try and draw some more general principles, I think, the closest framing we have of it today was got to be something like virtue ethics, right? And then the virtues are things like strength, a certain cunning,
beauty,
and then showing
excellence,
respect until someone disrespects you. Sort of a tit for tat type thing. Like, I think there is a general element in society where you're supposed to sort of begin with respect, and this manifests in terms of hospitality, right? So if a traveler or wanderer just shows up to your door, it seems like you're sort of expected to offer them food and maybe even gifts and sort of help them get where they're going. But if they disrespect you in any way, then it seems like, okay, all of a sudden your honor is insulted, and now it's your duty to either kill them or at least, maim them in some serious way and sort of respect and sort of defend your honor. So I think virtue ethics is sort of the closest, modern framing we might have to what they're after here. And then the question is just like, what sort of virtues is it? The interesting thing is, again, the question between the gods and mortal men. Are the gods actually held to any sort of virtuous standards? Are they expected to maintain any sort of moral norms? And I think my answer is basically no. It seems like the gods sort of create the norms, or at least not create the norms. I guess the gods are quite arbitrary, I think, in how they deal with humans. At the end when Athena's deciding to either help Odysseus kill the rest of the townspeople who are sort of rebelling against his return, she decides to step in and stop it, and Zeus sort of tells her, like, do whatever you want with it. Here's my recommendation, but, this is up to you. I don't care. So I think we're supposed to view the gods as sort of handing down arbitrary punishment from on high. And then there's these virtues that people are supposed to respect. And hopefully if you do that and sacrifice enough to the gods, then you won't get in too much trouble.
I'm not sure if I quite say that the gods don't hold them. They're certainly capricious and hypocritical and petty. But I think, there's even a scene in this which is kind of odd. It's one of Demodocus's, the poet in the Thracians. He starts randomly talking about the gods. Ares, the god of war, who is married to Aphrodite. I think. No, sorry, I'm getting.
Hephaestus is married to Aphrodite.
Yeah. Sorry,
he gets cucked by Ares.
He gets cucked, yeah. And this is this is a theme in the story where Agamemnon, king of the Greeks, who's more famous in the Iliad, he gets home and his wife has found his wife Clytemnestra has found a new man, and they've plotted and they kill him. So it's like he's cucked, but he's also ambushed and killed. And this is set up as like a direct direct contrast with Odysseus getting home and being concerned if he can trust his wife. But like it's also in the gods, and like they kind of make fun of him. Like there seem to be kind of ethics and standards around the gods as well, virtue, like them holding up to virtue. But I think they're all hypocrites and as well.
I'm not sure. It seems to be just a matter of will and strength among them, to be honest. It's like Poseidon's pissed at Odysseus, and if he has his way and Zeus gives him permission, he's going to punish Odysseus, and then if Athena gets her way, Odysseus won't be punished and he'll make it home. Like, I'm not sure I see any through line with how, for instance, Zeus is dealing with the rest of the gods. It seems to just come down to like self-interest.
Well, will seems to be one of the big virtues, right? This kind of like will to power. I don't know, like, yeah. What do you think about that, Rich? Around
Yeah, I'm more on Benny's side, that like my conception of these Greek gods are that they're extremely different to what we would consider to our modern conception of gods, who are moral arbiters and who uphold the moral law and expect good behavior. I think they're basically men. They're basically humans who live forever and have superpowers. And I think they are, as far as I can tell, almost completely immersed in the honor culture, virtue ethics style, very socially mediated, socially conscious behavior that all the humans are embroiled in. And I don't think that they are particularly trying to enforce any norms other than, you got to give respect to get respect, the sacrifices and showing hospitality and these kinds of things. Like, I think they are weirdly really similar to the men. They just have superpowers, which is like a crazy fucking thing to think about. Like, imagine today, like in our society, imagine there's another type of human that are just way more powerful than us and can never die.
Yeah.
And you just have to live with that. It's so weird. Like, and they're not like God who loves you and wants you to go to heaven and stuff. They're just like people who have weird, petty beliefs and rivalries and conspiracies, and it's just such a different conception of divinity. It's really fascinating to try and take on what that would be like.
I was always weird when there's a scene where someone's like, this person might be a god. Just like that being a thing, eh? Like, someone's acting a bit weird, or like, transforming, like, is this person a god? And then like, the gods are sleeping with them and stuff. Yeah, they're just kind of part of, everyday life.
But there's also that wink wink thing again, where like, instead of coming down as a god, 8 foot tall and glowing eyes or whatever, they come down as a person, have their interactions, and then they like transform into a bird and fly off. So it's like observing this weird ritual again, where they like are pretending to be modest for a while, just like Odysseus, pretending to be some humble traveler or whatever. And then they're like, oh, by the way, actually, like, I'm a god, and I need you to know that. Like, yeah, it's really funny. There's kind of some kind of politeness norm or something that even like the gods, honestly, I think the gods' behavior is just so similar to the mortal behavior that they are just like cousins or something. But how did we get started on the god track again?
Wait, okay, just
Benny's got a point. Benny's got a quick point.
Yeah,
I think this is arguably, if we're just looking at like the evolution of God as a sociological phenomenon, I think it makes way more sense to have cultures that start with a conception of God that is like humans with superpowers, right? Like, I think that's sort of the natural starting place, where you just wonder, like, where's the weather coming from? What's going on? Okay, there must just be super powerful beings who are in charge and controlling all of this. And you look around you, and some people are stronger than other people. Some people are more clever than other people, and then you just say, well, presumably this hierarchy sort of continues, and there are just these ultimate beings with superpowers. And it's not until you start getting certain conceptions of exploring the natural world and science and philosophy that you start realizing, like, okay, there are certain problems with this. And then your conception of God has to get more sophisticated, more nuanced, more abstract. And then you start moving towards like Abrahamic gods or just even more sophisticated conceptions of polytheism and stuff. So that's one. Second, though, I think it's sort of ironic that this conception of gods solves the problem of evil, I think, in a much better way than like a modern Judeo-Christian conception of God, where like a modern conception of God has this problem where you ask, you posit the existence of this being that's like infinitely good and wise, and then you ask yourself, well, okay, is good a conception that transcends them, and so they're just sort of they're good because they're channeling what good really is? And then it's like, well, if good sort of transcends whatever this being is, then in some sense they're not the ultimate being, because they can't change what good is, right? And like, why do we need them? We can just sort of appeal to what is good directly. But on the other hand, if they're kind of creating what's good, it seems very unsatisfactory to say, well, they could snap their fingers tomorrow and like murdering babies could be considered a good thing. It just seems too arbitrary and gross. But here, the Greeks basically just lean into the arbitrariness and they just say, yeah, like, we're not going to talk about good and bad. We're just going to talk about virtues and then trying to not piss off the gods. And like, that's actually a way more coherent way to deal with like how the gods are meting out justice and punishment and stuff than, you know, like the 2000 years later when we're arguing about, you know, whether Jesus can channel ultimate good and stuff. So yeah, there's ways in which this conception of religion is actually like, yeah, more technically sophisticated than modern conceptions, which I think is pretty interesting.
It is interesting.
Good
it's
point.
Interesting that like a founding myth of like of a people or culture, you know, it's ultimately like kind of about a man who's like, you know, really strong and impressive and, you know, of many turns and deceitful and gets his way, and then all these gods are kind of just about virtue and, you know, getting what you want and feeding others. And just, yeah, in contrast to like other founding myths where it's really more sort of didactic of like, you know, here are the 12 rules to like live a good life. And, you know, there is like, you have to like kind of show reverence to them and make sacrifices and stuff in this. But yeah, just maybe to bring it back to Bronze Age morality a bit more. I mean, do you have thoughts on what you think Bronze Age morality is, Rich?
The main thing I took away from this book, what I hadn't appreciated before, because we've talked a lot in previous book clubs about might is right and the will to power and some of the Nietzschean type stuff around how Christianity is a huge innovation in sort of valorizing the victims rather than the heroes, you know, heroes in the Homeric hero sense. What I've been able to add to that based on this read is how social connections are everything. So this, to me, this is like very much about the opinions of other people. Not everyone, of course, but like the opinions of other people who matter. Everything that is considered virtuous is about raising people's opinion of you and or their respect or fear of you. Honestly reminds me of The Sopranos so much. The same kind, like, you know, you got to give respect to get respect. Like, it's literally just that. And I think that is like the primitive way of, not primitive, but like that is the way that you deal with living in a very violent society. And it's not the best equilibrium. Like, we've found better equilibriums, but it is a equilibrium that you settle into.
It's gossip all the way down.
Gossip, but like paying respect, demonstrating your loyalty. And it's very like what I'm trying to say is that like with the modern concept of heroism, you don't have the might is right stuff, the superhero type. Everyone is a goody good. But also with the Byronic hero, the Mary Shelley Frankenstein type hero, it's very different also, where what is heroic is to be an individual in the world and to rebel against society. You know, John Milton's Satan or Victor Frankenstein or the monster himself is to be a sort of a tortured soul who is out of steps and out of sorts with the prevailing social and moral norms. That's another conception of morality. This is very different to that. It's very trad. Like, everything is by the book, doing what everyone expects you to do. That's what it means to be moral. And that's, I don't know. I just hadn't quite realized that. But it makes sense within its cultural context, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I was wondering like how much of these are sort of cultural adaptations to like let groups of people survive. So if you look at like hospitality obviously plays this role, right? So if there's this like expected norm where as a traveler you show up and you're often like gifted food and then perhaps like a way to get to your next destination. This is obviously extremely helpful because traveling at this time would have been incredibly dangerous and there's no telling, you know, how you might be injured on your way to the next town or whatever. So if sort of like an entire country of people adopts this norm, like, hey, we're going to sort of help travelers. That's going to be our first instinct. That's just going to be like a positive sum aspect that's going to help everyone sort of get around. And then like if just more generally, like if you make the norms known. So if it's clear that if you kill someone's son, for instance, that they're going to come and try and kill you, that also like may seem brutal, but somehow plays this important like communicative role in society where it's like, okay, if the norms are established, we all know what to expect from one another, and it makes interactions like more safe and easy. And so in that sense, like virtue ethics, it's easier to navigate a world where everyone's acting like a virtue ethicist and you know what the virtues are beforehand than if everyone's like, you know, their own sort of private brand of consequentialist, and you don't quite know how they're thinking about things, and you're not sure what their expectations are, and you're not sure like what's going to make them angry or when they're going to mete out justice or any of this stuff. So like just it's the legibility of a lot of these rules, and like everyone seems to sort of be on the same page about what to expect and what not to expect, that makes it interesting and like, yeah, advantageous, I think, in some way for everyone.
I mean, to cite something even from the text, just around that point, later on, where which we'll talk about more in the next episode, where when Odysseus returns and like meets out justice to the suitors, rough justice.
Yeah.
Well, Bronze Age, but you know, to keep it on this topic, like Bronze Age justice.
Yeah.
One of the suitors, like, he seems not as bad as the others. Like, a lot of them are described as like kind of pretty nasty, arrogant people, and then one of them seems not as bad, but he's kind of caught up with it. But like, he still gets the rough justice, and there is kind of this question of like, you know, that seemed extra rough justice for that guy. But I think to Benny's point is, I think to Benny's point is kind of like, you know, yeah, there are these clear lines. Like, you know, if you are complicit with this, and you know, you kind of went and took the food that you shouldn't, all that, like, yeah, you get it as well. And like the gods say this as well. So like for you know, for all Odysseus' men, like, you know, if you don't eat the castle, like, you know, like you're done, and there's kind of no way out, really.
Okay, cool. So let's wrap up for this week, because we've still got heaps more to talk about. Next time we're going to talk about the vanquishing of the suitors. We haven't talked about Penelope at all. We'll get more into Odysseus' character. Yeah, Telemachus. I think maybe some more about Athena, possibly some more chat about the gods, and I think the morality. So yeah, looking forward to that, but we'll leave it here for now.
Nice
work, guys.
Epic.
Sweet. Epic.